Siddhartha passed his youthful years in leisure and luxury within the king's palace. At the king's request, gardeners had constructed lotus tanks throughout the land to express their devotion to Dharma and to create a paradise for their prince. While Siddhartha enjoyed games and sported with palace maidens, Shuddhodana ruled honorably over his empire for the sake of his up-and-coming son, and he practiced self-restraint while pursuing spiritual matters for the benefit of his subjects. Shuddhodana also avoided the pursuit of religion for the sake of profit, and as a true follower of Vedic tradition, the king drank soma. So the prosperity of the Raja and his kingdom seemed all but ensured as he watched his coddled son mature into a promising heir to the throne. Siddhartha had even conceived a healthy little boy by his beautiful wife, Yashodhara, which could only have given his father all the more reason to feel secure in the future of his royal line. Now, Siddhartha spent his adolescent years within the confines of the king's palace. But eventually, he developed a curiosity for the people and the kingdom over which he was destined to rule one day. The king could not forget, however, about Asita's prophecy that Siddhartha was destined to become either a universal monarch, a Chakravartin, or a great ascetic, a mendicant in the forest. Now, Shuddhodana naturally intended for his son to follow in his royal footsteps. So he arranged to allow the curious prince a brief but well-planned sojourn through the streets of Kapilavastu in hopes that Siddhartha would see and know only about the pleasant side of life in the kingdom. Because the king assumed that were his son to become disillusioned by the many disagreeable realities of life, such as disease, decrepitude, suffering, and death, he might feel inclined to choose the path of an ascetic. So when the momentous day finally arrives for the prince to mount a golden chariot and travel beyond the confines of the palace walls, the prince finds, to his great delight, that the king's gardens are filled with lotus groves and an abundance of beautiful women that throng the streets with radiant lotus-like faces. At first glance, Siddhartha viewed the kingdom of his father as a paradise, a world that was filled with heavenly mansions of lotus nymphs. However, it came to pass that the gods had agreed to make known to Siddhartha a more realistic view of life, and connived to place themselves among the throngs of healthy well-wishers that the king had arranged to greet the prince in the streets of Kapilavastu. The gods had schemed, you see, to transform themselves into the sort of subjects that had been banished from the streets by the king. One of the gods assumed, for example, the disguise of an old man, and he walked among the crowds to reveal the true and unavoidable destiny of all living creatures to Siddhartha. In this broken man, Siddhartha witnessed the handiwork of old age and decrepitude, aging being the destroyer of beauty and vigor and the enemy of the senses. Then another god crossed the path of the prince in the aspect of a pale and sickly man, such that Siddhartha might know the signs and symptoms of disease and suffering. Next, the gods placed a dead man in the prince's path, so that the prince could behold the destiny of all living creatures. And then, yet another god appeared upon the streets in the body and garb of an ascetic beggar, so that the prince might understand that Siddhartha's beauty and life were transitory by nature, and that all creatures must ultimately confront the same fate, the eventuality of ugliness, suffering, and death. In order to shield the prince from these unexpected and gruesome sights, assistants of the king were quick to whisk Siddhartha away to the king's Padmasanda Grove, for here he would only find beautiful women congregating around lotus tanks like throngs of lotus nymphs. This ploy was late in coming, however, since the prince could now no longer rest at ease with the satisfying beauty of his healthy subjects. For he now was aware that all beauty and well-being is bound to dissipate over the course of time. Lotus-eyed maidens that emerged from the lotus beds of Kapilavastu's gardens no longer attracted the lotus-faced prince. Although they continued to clasp him, they say, with their tender arm creepers and display their full bosoms like golden jars, reminding Siddhartha of any number of lotus goddesses. Siddhartha felt little satisfaction for their attentions. So Siddhartha's goal in life takes a fateful turn at this juncture. The prince is now inspired to seek an escape from the throes of rebirth, not only for the benefit of himself, but also for the salvation of his family members and the people of Shravasti. Having been told by the king that he could no longer then leave the palace grounds, Siddhartha resolved to escape from the artificial realities of palace life and to seek a path to bliss. So it happens that, on one restless night, the prince experienced a prophetic dream in which he saw a lotus shoot arise from his navel and reach into the heavens. This propitious vision sets the stage for his next critical experience, this being known as the Great Departure, the Maha Binishkramana. The aspiring prince would now seek to break away from his house arrest and to search for the salvation of everybody. But this goal would require, once again, a little assistance from those ever-cooperative gods in the heavens. Siddhartha's divine assistance caused a deep sleep to fall upon the palace guards, his attendants and concubines, which allowed Siddhartha now to follow his bliss. As the Buddhacharita notes, like broken and withered lotus stems and flowers, the palace maidens were strewn across the floors in deep sleep, the beauty of their lotus eyes now concealed like flower buds that closed themselves upon the setting of the sun. Observing the maidens lying immodestly on the floor, with their breasts exposed and legs spread apart, with gaping and snoring mouths that allowed their saliva to ooze out, Siddhartha saw that their young beauty was, in fact, tainted and transitory. So, as the world slept, Siddhartha began to display the qualities of a bodhisattva, of an awakened being. His body began to shine like the glow of a sun, like a sun that has climbed to the summit of the god's great lotus mountain, Mount Meru. And by this light, he began to dispel the world's darkness with the splendor of his awakening self. These verses reminding us of the plant god Soma in the Vedas, who is repeatedly said to, quote-unquote, dispel the darkness of the world. In this mythic image of a woke bodhisattva beginning his heroic mission as the world sleeps, we might also recognize the mythic character of Vedic Agni, who, as a sun-like Brahmin in the Rig Veda, arises in the sky when the rest of the world, they say, is fast asleep. Or likewise, in a text that was more or less contemporaneous with early Buddha biographies, the Bhagavad Gita, we encounter the same motif. While satiated by the nectar of Vishnu's truth, an accomplished Brahmin in this text chants, and I quote, "What is night for all beings, therein the man of restraint is awake." Bodhi is the term that we use for awake, and it is the state and the meaning of Buddha. This was the original meaning of a woke being in India's days of yore, which, like the swastika, has, it seems, kind of lost its original meaning over the years. As the palace guards slept, Siddhartha awakened his two most trusted friends, which would be a white steed by the name of Kantaka, and his charioteer, Chanda. According to the Buddha Charita, thus the best of men, beautiful in form and shining like black-tracked Agni, instructed the white horse, as white as a lotus flower, the best of steeds in his duty, as though he were a friend, to enter the forest like the sun, blazing like fire, as it mounts a white autumnal cloud. At this particular moment, Siddhartha, Kantaka, and Chanda receive assistance once again from those gods. For it was Indra who saw fit to unlock the gates of Shuddhadana's palace and lead the intrepid explorers into the night. And as the palace doors were opened, a helpful group of yakshas began to raise their golden lotus-formed hands into the sky, thereby supporting the strides of the Buddha's favorite steed. Says the Mahavastu, the four guardians of the world, in their brilliant diadems and flowing garlands, put their hands that were as red lotus blossoms under the hoofs of Kantaka. In front, Indra, the wielder of the thunderbolt, the teacher of the 33 devas, the 1,000-eyed, went before the best of men. One might think that it was the horse Kantaka that bore him, but in reality it was the devas, the yakshas who carried in their noble hands the tiger of eloquence, he who sheds wondrous rays of light around him. As Siddhartha exited the palace like a Vedic sky god, like a solar steed, all of these being mythic images of Soma Pavamana in the past, Siddhartha stopped for a moment to look back at the life he had once enjoyed in the deluded world of his earthly so-called paradise, the palace, and began to ponder the path he was now bound to follow. The Buddha Charita adds, he whose eyes were long, like stainless lotuses born of the mud, looked back at the city and uttered a lion roar. I shall not be entering the city named after Kapila till I have seen the further shore of life and death. When Siddhartha eventually arrived at a hermitage that seemed suited for the practice of penance, he requested of his two companions, his charioteer and horse, that they return to the palace and inform the king about his quest for immortality. Siddhartha's trusted attendants were initially hesitant to comply with his request, but such were the demands of the prince. And at this juncture, the Bodhisattva performs an important symbolic gesture, the meaning of which is somewhat obscure to modern translators. He divests himself of his royal attire and then shears a top knot of hair called the ushnisa from his head. The sacrifice of the sage's top knot appears to be very significant, since the scene is included in all known versions of Siddhartha's tale. But the meaning of the gesture is unclear. It would seem likely that the scene relates to a ritual practice, however, performed by young Brahmanic initiates while preparing for a specific form of the Soma sacrifice during this very age of the Buddha, a sacrifice known as the Shrauta sacrifice. We find evidence of this practice in an earlier Brahmanic text entitled The Laws of Manu, which states, some declare that students who have returned home on completion of their studentship shall never shave, except if engaged in the initiation to a Shrauta sacrifice. Now a Brahmana also declares, verily, an empty, uncovered pot is he whose hair is shaved off entirely. The top lock is his covering. But at sacrificial sessions, the top lock must be shaved off because it is so required in the Veda. Since the gesture is made when the Bodhisattva is said to bear the appearance of the mythical lotus mountain known as Mount Mandara, and displays swastikas and dharma chakras on his hands, we have reason to believe we are dealing once again with a motif that relates to the sacred lotus. This assumption is supported by the various ways in which the Ushnisa is rendered in Buddhist iconography. For example, a flaming motif is often portrayed as the top knot, but sometimes the flame arises from an open lotus flower on the Buddha's head, as we observe here on this 15th century bronze bust from Sukhothai, Thailand. On other occasions, the top knot is simply a lotus flower, as seen on this 10th century bronze from Bagan, Burma. Whatever the underlying significance of the Ushnisa, the severance of the top knot relates on one level to Siddhartha's formal abandonment of his former aristocratic life of ease and abundance. Here, the Bodhisattva would be joined by 5 naked hermits that believed the prince's, quote-unquote, Indra-like qualities might bring success to Brihaspati. Now, this expression is interesting because the success of Vedic Brihaspati refers specifically to the defeat of serpent demons and the procurement of Soma in the ancient Vedas. So we are given to conclude that the same idea applies in some way to Siddhartha. The goal of bringing success to Brihaspati was not, however, the only goal of Siddhartha. The prince expressly states that his intention was to go a step further and to transcend, to go beyond the heavenly paradise of Indra, which is to say, to exceed the stature of a god by seeking release from rebirth into the world of gods and mortals. The Buddha Charita states the case as such. But he who dissociates his mind from the joy of that ecstasy gains the third trance, which is blissful, but void of ecstasy. No one really knows what all that means, but the people who wrote this tale did. Brahman, which lies beyond the manifestations of material nature, prakriti, and consciousness, purusha, which is to say, the next and final step above and beyond Indra and Brihaspati.